Hello, I am going to be reading out two X's which are from two different people in two different professions about two different subjects, and yet they converge in a strange sort of way, in a creepy sort of way. How our ruling elite and the entire government machinery seems to have been kidnapped by some strange, unaccountable way of thinking. Okay, I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. All right, so the first one is from a civil servant. I've taken the name out of the screen because it's a personal story. I haven't told this story before, it says, but given the way in which the government is behaving, I feel compelled to do so. Last year, I was essentially forced out of the civil service. Up until July of 2024, I was a civil servant in the Home Office, where I had spent the previous 4 years working in the field of public inquiries. Which is why I feel so strongly about the Labour government's refusal to order an inquiry into the gang rape scandal plaguing our country. Many reading will know that I have been a strong advocate against sterilising and mutilating children in the name of gender ideology. So this person has obviously voiced his opinions about this situation. However, I always kept my work life and personal life completely separate in order to ensure that I could carry out my work as a civil servant with integrity and neutrality. Look, you can have strong feelings about something, but if you're working in the field of public inquiries, your personal feelings shouldn't interfere with your ability to set up whatever these inquiries entailed to gather information and write reports. I never discussed my advocacy at work. I never mentioned my civil service role in my personal advocacy and campaigning. I had even specifically sought guidance from the Cabinet Office as to whether anything in civil service policy prohibited my advocacy. No response in the affirmative ever came. So he did everything he should do to make sure that he was keeping within permissible guidelines. This is in contrast to many of my colleagues who bring their activism into the workplace. My line manager, for example, had pronouns in her email signature along with a rainbow flag and allyship slogan. However, when the inquiry I had been on secondment to concluded, I noticed strange things happening. I was told that my previous role no longer existed. Promises to move me to another inquiry were reneged upon. I was given work to do only for it to disappear into a vacuum, never to be seen again. I was subsequently told I was at risk of redundancy. I think this is usually referred to as constructive dismissal, isn't it? But it's a terrible thing when he did work on something and then the work just disappeared. Somebody was definitely getting at him. Now, of course, there's always the chance that this person is mentally unstable and imagining things. But I don't think so, and that's why I'm reading this out. This was confusing and unsettling, I'm sure it was, as the inquiry I led had performed extremely well, finishing on time and under budget, which is rare for public inquiries. Then, a few days before Christmas 2023, I was told, with no prior indication, that there would be a formal investigation into a few posts I made on X back in July 2023. So that was something from 6 months before. So just before Christmas, when he was due to go on holiday, they told him that he was under suspicion of something unpleasant. That was the Christmas present he got. The posts in question related to me raising concerns about members of the Labour Party and their fanaticism when it came to gender ideology, and the risks to child safeguarding as a result. For example, Keir Starmer saying that women could have a penis, and Labour supporting self-ID for men who claim they are women. I spent the next 6 months being dragged through an investigation. During the investigation, after putting in a subject access request for my personal data, I discovered to my horror how the investigation had come about. You see, he had no idea why he was being investigated for something that had happened 6 months before. And apparently and he could only find out, nobody was telling him, he could only find out by insisting on a sort of freedom of information mechanism. The office of the permanent secretary, so somebody in the office or the permanent secretary himself or herself, had instructed the professional standards unit to go digging into the private social media accounts of certain members of staff, including mine. So it looks like there was a sweep going on. Colleagues were tasked with snooping through my ex account. This was a fishing expedition. So they were looking for incriminating tweets. Nothing that he'd said had caused a fuss. They were just looking for something that they could use. At this point, it was increasingly looking like a Labour government would be formed following the next general election. It became clear to me that the Home Office were trying to shut down employees who could be seen as a problem for Labour. So it looks like the civil service was preparing itself for a Labour government by cleaning out anti-Labour people or people who didn't follow the Labour line. And of course, we're talking here about gender identity, but this would be other stuff like the Labour attitude to the Middle East, for instance, or the Labour attitude to the USA. Of course, I have no proof of that, but I can't believe it would have just happened to people who were talking about gender identity and nothing else. Tellingly, during one of my hearings, the investigator asked me something along the lines of, if we get a Labour Home Secretary soon, how do you think they will feel reading your posts on X? Do you not think they might be offended? All right, so what this investigator said was that a Labour minister would go back and check the tweets of one of the civil servants from 6 months or a year before, by this time well into a year before, and would then become offended because they had a different opinion about gender identity in this particular case. The idea that you have to stop people from being offended is one of the most pernicious philosophical ideas which is destroying our culture and civilization. And the fact that an investigator might say that a minister would be offended and at all costs we mustn't do that because of an opinion that you have. Well, first of all, let's face it, we don't know what the Home Secretary's opinion on gender identity really is. So the person being offended is more likely to be the investigator at that particular juncture. OK, and then he says, even then, the establishment were gleefully gearing up for Labour. So you see, I'm not so sure the investigator was worried about the Home Secretary feeling offended. What the investigator was doing was purifying the department, clearing them out of any worker there who might not agree wholeheartedly with the Labour narrative. At the end of the investigation, I was warned that if I continued with my personal advocacy around child safeguarding, that I would be charged with gross misconduct and could lose my job. So we have a sort of upside down terminology here, where looking after children and preventing harm from coming to children is gross misconduct. This was not something I could afford. I jumped before I was pushed and agreed to a voluntary redundancy, which is what they were forcing him into anyway. We know that. He continues, I wish I could say I was the only civil servant shut down for having the wrong opinions. Make no mistake, it's a relief to now be free of it altogether. And there will be other civil servants who will have been cleared out for other wrong opinions. As I said, other political opinions that these investigators might have said the incoming government's ministers will be offended by your opinions. However, what this experience taught me is that we have an activist and ideologically minded civil service enthralled to Labour, content to undermine free speech at every turn. This should worry us all. Well, it certainly worries me. And it worries David Atherton as well. One of my followers is a teacher who went through the Prevent programme training. Prevent is the organisation that's supposed to catch people, young people usually, at risk of radicalisation. And if you, when you get through this tweet, you'll see why Axel Rudakabana was ignored by Prevent. I think on 3 occasions, that's what I have in my memory. On 3 occasions, Prevent said he was not a suitable subject for Prevent. Nothing to see here. Move along now. And when you see this X here, you'll see why. Because Prevent is not talking about Islamism. And so they didn't reckon that Rudakabana was a threat. One of my followers is a teacher who went through the Prevent programme training. It made little mention of the Islamic threat. Hi, David. Please keep this anonymous, the usual employment issues. So here's somebody who's afraid to speak out because he or she will lose his job for mentioning that Prevent is not doing its job. And there's no amount of national inquiries which will sort this out. You'll see why in a minute or two. I'm a teacher who had to do the mandatory Prevent training plus teach some of it to Year 9 5 years ago. So this teacher was being made aware by Prevent of the problems of radicalisation and, I suppose, how to identify radicalisation and how to refer at-risk pupils to the proper authorities. Now, I'm not up on school years now, but I rather think Year 9 would be the early teenage years, 13, 14, maybe 15, depending on, the half-year business. I'm a teacher who had to do the mandatory Prevent training plus teach some of it to Year 9 5 years ago. It's totally unfit for purpose, as the focus is on the EDL and the far right as the most likely source of radicalisation. Now, I remember Keir Starmer making a speech in which he talked about the EDL. The EDL doesn't exist anymore. he talked about the far right a lot. And I'm sure at one point he mentioned the EDL as well. There is no such thing as the EDL. It's like talking about Mosley's black shirts. I mean, it's in the past. And the fact that they can talk about the EDL, it means that they're not even looking in the right places. They're making things up. They're making up monsters and fighting monsters that don't exist. Totally unfit for purpose, focuses on the EDL and far right as the most likely source of radicalisation. It is delivered by a Muslim lecturer and mentions the EDL and laughably the IRA, but barely touches on radical Islam. So that is your answer why Rudakabana was rejected as a suitable subject for Prevent, because he wasn't in the EDL or the IRA. As you can well imagine, no one in teaching ever questions it. Yes, because our teaching profession, to a very large degree, has been captured by the same sort of fairy tale philosophy that you could see in this tweet here about the civil service. As you can well imagine, no one in teaching ever questions it, not because they agree with it, but because they are frightened of being labelled a racist. Certainly they would be labelled a racist if they started questioning the Muslim lecturer who's talking about the EDL, which doesn't exist. It would be worth you finding some of those resources to analyse, the teacher finishes. Now, focus on the EDL on the far right. It reminds me of a joke that I was told by a Hungarian. It came from Hungary's communist days, and as is often the case with Middle European humour, gets right to the point of what's wrong without actually saying what's wrong. And it goes like this. A policeman on his beat at night sees a man loitering near a street lamp. Actually, the man isn't loitering, he's walking up and down and round the street lamp, peering at the ground. Well, the policeman thinks maybe he's waiting for somebody and carries on his beat. But an hour later, when he's coming back along the same route, that man is still there and still pacing around near the light. And so he decides that possibly this is a time to ask the man what he's doing. So he walks up to the man and he says, "Why are you standing here? You've been here for over an hour." And the man says, "Yeah, I was getting into my car, and as I was trying to unlock the door, I dropped my car keys, and now I can't find them." And the policeman says, "Oh, goodness, well, they can't be that far away. Which one is your car here? And I'll help you look for the keys." And the man said, "Yeah, well, my car's there on the other side of the car park." And the policeman said, "Well, if you drop the keys next to your car and it's on the other side of the car park, why are you looking for the keys here?" So the man looks up at the street light, rolls his eyes and said, "For goodness sake, isn't it obvious? There's no light over there." It's the same in this situation here. If we get a Labour Home Secretary soon, how do you think they'll feel reading your posts on X? Do you not think they might be offended? It's the same attitude. Let's not talk about things that don't follow the Muslim narrative, which in many ways is the Labour narrative right now. Even during his speech, when Keir Starmer was addressing the nation, he ended up talking about protecting mosques. And not talking about how Prevent dumped an obviously disturbed subject because, well, he wasn't in the EDL, was he? OK, till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.